We're talking in this session about the industry's role in the race to net zero, and we're going to cover a little bit about the environment, low carbon, net zero, COP26, lots of good stuff to cover.
When we think about net zero, it's real world net zero. So effectively, the entire planet, the global economy, getting to zero carbon equivalent emissions. So it's not just carbon, also methane, etc. And I think one of the key points is that it's the real world. Easy to shift a portfolio to make it look like it is potentially aligned with net zero in the future, i.e. you could buy a lot of software companies, sell a lot of slightly higher capital intensity businesses, and you could see a scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions intensity change for that portfolio. And you could be very happily saying you're aligned with net zero in your portfolio, but that is not real world net zero, and that's not going to help us solve this huge problem that we face as a planet.
The problem we have at the moment, both globally and in our industry, is that there is no net zero 2050 alignment at present in the aggregate. I'm sure we're going to get into this in more detail when we talk about COP and policy, but it is quite important because it's very, very difficult for financial flows to align with 2050 objectives if global policy is not aligned with 2050 objectives and in a credible manner. So I think it's very important for the listeners to understand that net zero, it is what is required to ever be able to stabilize global temperatures, right? You're in runaway climate change forever unless you eventually get to net zero, because you can't stabilize atmospheric sort of concentration of CO2 and equivalents otherwise, but that is not the same thing as a 2050 alignment.
Net zero, on the one hand, from a financing standpoint, we need to be bold and ambitious and think about what are some of the levers we can pull to really make sure that there is change in the real economy by way of directing financing. But at the same time, we need to also start investing and be prepared for what we call climate adaptation, right? Because extreme weather events will continue to happen, frequency will go up. I don't think it's possible for us to really cap the temperature rise at 1.5 given existing policies as well as technologies that's available. Of course, there is still hope, but we also need to make sure that, if we look at communities that are most vulnerable, we need to be prepared for what's going to come online as well.
We started as a firm in the emerging markets. I think we have quite a different perspective from many. But if you look at really who's created this problem, it really is the Western world. So if you look at cumulative emissions, the US has created about 25%, Europe and the UK about 22%, China 15%, so is catching up and will catch up over time, and India is about 3%. So I think we need to understand, living in the Western world, that we probably should be supporting these emerging market countries in this transition, understand they are further behind, understand we need to be allocating capital there and helping to not only educate but work with and provide capital to understand this could take longer for some of these countries.
There is no race to net zero at the moment, right? Or at least it's a race that actually much of the world's economy isn't actually competing in, right? There's a subset of companies that are in the race to net zero. There's a subset of countries that are arguably in a race to net zero. Then there's a whole bunch who aren't even in the game. So that point that Graham made, for example, about the amount of investment that is required to get onto these pathways, I mean, that is all true, but that investment is not taking place. So we have to be very careful about this phrase. I mean, it's a very clever phrase, the race to net zero, and it's a way of sort of generating sort of excitement and activity about lifting ambition, which is very important. But what we don't want to confuse is what is actually happening from what we want to happen, because again, you have to analyze these things differently.
In a nutshell, what are we aiming for? I think for us, from a stewardship standpoint, we are aiming to speak to every company beyond just TCFD risk disclosure, but really going deep into how they set those targets that they have, how credible these targets are, how aligned are they to our own internal model as to what a right trajectory should look like for companies in a specific sector. And it could be automobile, it could be agriculture, et cetera. And then on the other hand, continue to invest in climate expertise. So that includes data, analytical tool, talent, et cetera, so that we can be, hopefully ahead of the game, but on par with how science is developing, as well as regulations and tech, so that we can, on a continuous basis, factor all of that into how we help our clients.
There is no part of our investment universe where the nature of climate risk and opportunity is not formally taken into account. And because, even though you can tell I'm not especially optimistic about net zero 2050 alignment, there is no doubt that there is still a significant energy transition taking place, right? Or another way to put that is, if you think about a global equity benchmark, right, there's going to be a significant reduction in the carbon intensity of those benchmarks over the next 5 years, over the next 10 years and beyond. And we need a forward-looking framework, and we've developed one for taking that into account and embedded in our investment process.
What's really interesting and worrying as well is there's a lot of discussions about policy changes, how that may impact the way we think about specific sectors, and then also what are the opportunities. So one of the things that's worrying is that I think there's a lot of focus on a few key sectors, but still not enough attention on sectors that really, really are hard to abate and need lots of transformation. There is more, for example, on attention on agriculture as a sector, right? They are one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases. So, what are the opportunities there that we could invest in to help them to transition is really critical.
To finish on a positive note, there are huge opportunities out there. And as Jennifer touched on, things such as agriculture are probably in that more nuanced bucket. And we look across all of global decarbonisation, not just the energy transition. And growing things, plants, animals makes up about 20% of global carbon emission. Industry makes up another 20%. So we're looking at the future of the factory. And we just believe that this is such an exciting long-term structural growth opportunity. And yes, there are certain subsegments within that may be pricing in closer to a 1.5 degree scenario, but there are many, many others that really aren't. And as the data shows, we are a long, long way from that 1.5 degrees warming scenario. So a lot needs to happen from here. And this is just the beginning.